Hello everyone, I apologize that this video will be uploaded late. I wanted to get my computer back on Sunday, but unfortunately I did not get it back until late Monday, so it took roughly around 3 days or so for it to finally be brought in. I actually believe we brought it in on, no, we actually brought it in on Saturday, so yeah, it took like 3 days for it to go through and basically be cleaned. So that's why this video is going to be uploaded late as a result. But I thought it would be interesting to take a fan request and a film that I kind of wanted to definitely look into that I have not explored yet. And as you can see by the title, that film is Pinocchio. A couple of weeks ago, I believe, I discussed Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and how I thought it was a classic Disney film. Pinocchio, I feel, is on that same level. I believe that it has all of the qualities of a good Disney film, and therefore I am putting it in the classic category. And we'll be discussing just the film and not the book, even though I did touch on the book in one of my videos from eons ago, where I compared and contrasted to the Disney version, but I'll be strictly focusing on what the Disney version was trying to say, and I'll try to point here and there to the original source material, but I'm going to try to maintain my focus here on the film since this is a Classic Movie Monday. What I think is really cool about this film is that it reflects onto certain morals, certain values that were emphasized to our children eons ago and are sort of emphasized to our children nowadays, which is, work hard, go to school, educate yourself, and try to become the best you can be in order to contribute eventually to society and make society better. That's kind of the morals that Pinocchio takes. And it does it in a way that is fairly clever and also, I think, very frightening to children. And I think that's almost a good thing because it's kind of good to scare the bejeebers out of your kids, and then they'll realize that they shouldn't do bad things to begin with. So again, but those are really ultimately certain things that the film emphasizes. But there's also an emphasis too on the importance of family bonding and love and caring for somebody else, and trying to prove yourself to the world. And that's sort of what Pinocchio as a film did. Now, some people, in particular the nostalgia critic, and I've heard some others argue, why didn't she make him good to begin with, or with all of the lessons learned? Well, there's another important point that deals with sort of the moral construct of the film, and that's choice. It is sort of reflected in the original work, but the film, I think, does a better job of emphasizing it. The point within the film is that the Blue Fairy didn't make him good because ultimately good is based upon individual choice and the choices that you ultimately make. You can always choose whether to do something good or something bad. She didn't want the lessons learned because Pinocchio, even though he was a puppet, was an individual, and individuals end up making the choices, not somebody who ultimately created you. Like, even if you're given a certain amount of discipline as a child, you ultimately make choices in life, and those choices have a big impact. So that's what I think the film was largely focusing on too is this idea of Pinocchio becoming more of an individual, more of a better self. And that can't be achieved just by magic. That's done by individual choice. So I think the emphasis was the Blue Fairy created him, but knew that ultimately the choices that he would end up making in life weren't determined by her and couldn't be determined by her, because Pinocchio is an individual, and individuals make their own choices. So that's, I think, something that people miss sometimes. I know it's a little complicated to understand, but that's really the point of the story. It's supposed to emphasize the idea that, you know, you should focus on your morals, you should focus on your values, and you should try to do the best that you can, and in doing so, give something back to society, and therefore become more of yourself, as opposed to being rebellious and you know, against society and trying to tear society down and all that stuff, which is something that Pleasant Island is a perfect example of. Again, the kids go and they destroy all this stuff. Now, the interesting thing that I find too about this film that I wanted to bring up, and I apologize if this doesn't sound too PC or whatnot, but the other Disney film that I touched upon, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, it was a very emotional film. It was a very feminine-oriented film, in that it was largely based more upon emotions and upon the sense of beauty and this genuine peaceful, soothing, and yet kind of crazy atmosphere. It's just sort of swirling, that film. It's not designed to be as based within moral groundings. It's more designed to be an artistic representation of emotion and of how these emotions can bring out the best within us and can also bring out the worst. Contrast Snow White, who is kind and optimistic, to the Queen, who is harsh, cruel, and sinister, and filled with rage and with no love. So again, it's supposed to provide emotion as its source for the morals, kind of within the film. But it doesn't really focus so much upon the morals. It's just they're there, but they're not the center of attention. They're more about the emotions associated with the morals. Whereas Pinocchio is a more straightforward with its morals, because it presents them through the plot. And Pinocchio is a little bit. It was the first film that has a boy, a male, as our center figure, not a woman. So I find that to be interesting, because there's sort of this contrast that I see with Pinocchio and Snow White. And it's not to say that one film is better than the other. I think they're both great in their different ways. But I think what's great about Pinocchio is that it centers around boys and boy characters. And you get that sort of interpretation presented to you onto the screen, as opposed to a female interpretation. So that's what I thought was really fascinating about this sort of contrast when I was looking at the two films. What's interesting too about Pinocchio is it not only focuses just on boys as a group, but on the things that ultimately boys end up doing. Um, and again, it's not to say that girls don't do these things. It's just that it's more something that's a little bit more common within the male demographic. I think it's this kind of camaraderie, and you sort of see it when Pinocchio meets Lampwick, one of the boys who's sent off to Pleasant Island, and you see how the film really centers on ultimately the destructive behavior that these boys exhibit when they're under these kinds of circumstances where they're not given any amount of responsibility for their actions or anything. And sort of how chaotic and crazy it becomes. But I found it interesting that it was mostly boy-centered and focused more on males. The only female character in this entire film is the Blue Fairy. But I'll get to her more later. But again, I think the premise and the focus is a lot more on a male interpretation, and on a male understanding of things. And I think that's kind of how it showcases itself in Pinocchio. You kind of see the sort of disasters that end up resulting from this kind of rebellion that these boys end up taking when they go to Pleasure Island. I keep messing it up. I'm sorry if I call it Pleasant Island. It's Pleasure Island. But yeah, I think that's why I found that's why it was interesting to see sort of the contrast, because again, Snow White 2 is a fairy tale and Pinocchio is more based upon a book. So you do kind of see too those different sort of tones that it tries to aim at. And I think Pinocchio's aim is a little bit more straightforward and more focused in on emotion than what Snow White was. Even though it is emotion centered, because film is largely based within emotion, it's not in the same way as Snow White. I think it is more based within a sort of it's more based in, I think, a straightforward understanding. You have these kids who rebel, and then they end up being punished for it. As opposed to Snow White, where the morals aren't really so clear-cut as much as, just don't be jealous. There's just a lot of different emotional things going on that really the morals don't really impact the story all so much as the emotions that the characters end up exhibiting because of those morals. With Pinocchio, I guess you could say it's similar in that respects to when Pinocchio changes, but again, I think the story itself is a little bit more it's a little bit more straightforward, I feel, and not as based within trying to create, again, a fairy tale, something that's more based around things that don't make sense. So that was something that I thought was really interesting. I really like too how this film focuses on Pinocchio's development, and I like how they make him a real boy pretty much throughout the entire thing, even though he's a puppet. And the interesting thing about Pinocchio's character is that his growth and development goes in these different stages of him being naive and then him going along for the sake of going along with things, and then at the same time as he's going through certain scenarios, you do see how he ultimately tries to do better. So I think the film did a really good job focusing on that and creating this very dark atmosphere with those um, scenarios that end up affecting Pinocchio's growth and development. And ultimately, at the end, he ends up proving his worth. And again, this is all. It all comes back down to that individual choice. I can choose to do wrong, or I can choose to do good. So it's really more about him rather than ultimately his relationships with other people. But that's not to say it's an egotistical film. It's just that the focus is on improving Pinocchio as a person, and you see how ultimately his acts end up reflecting that individual choice of good and growth that make him ultimately a real boy. I don't know if I'm really giving anything away at the end because I think the majority of people have seen Pinocchio or at least heard of it. However, in a nutshell, if you've not seen this film or have not heard of the story, basically Pinocchio is a wooden puppet who's brought to life by a blue fairy, and she gives him she says that he will be a real boy if he proves himself brave, truthful, and unselfish. And so you see throughout his entire journey how he comes across these colorful characters who try to kind of stray him away from that good path of being brave, truthful, and unselfish. And then you ultimately see his journey and how he ultimately becomes a real boy as a result. And then you see how Geppetto, who initially wanted him in the first place, because he sort of wished for it in the beginning, how Geppetto is sort of impacted from Pinocchio sort of coming to life. Even though that is definitely not the focus here. The focus is more on Pinocchio as a person, and ultimately how his good acts end up reflecting onto him and how he ultimately ends up becoming a better person as a result. So that's the film in a nutshell. Now, I did want to mention the Blue Fairy because she is the only real female character in this. I think she's sort of supposed to just represent that kind of fairy godmother figure, in that she brings good upon the person, but ultimately it's that person's choice whether or not they use that bit of magic or that bit of sprinkle that she gives to ultimately do good. I guess it's kind of similar to Cinderella in that, she, the fairy godmother gives her a sprinkle of happy and says, go out, but it's not going to last you long. And, you can tell that Cinderella takes full advantage of it. And you see, but with Pinocchio, it's obviously different, though, because you see how he ultimately is strayed away, and how ultimately the plot gets more complicated as it goes along. But really, in a nutshell, the Blue Fairy sort of serves as a symbol of goodness, in that I'm going to sprinkle on this little goodness for you, and you can decide whether or not to ultimately use that sprinkle that I gave you for good or for ill. And I think that's what she's supposed to represent. That idea. And I think that idea was really popular within like these kinds of children's stories, fairy godmothers, blue fairy, it's kind of that same sprinkle of magic goodness onto you character. So that's what she serves as, and she sort of represents that kind of good feminine nature of being kind and being being friendly and open. She also seems to have sort of a wise demeanor about herself. And yeah, she serves as a good character. And you sort of see how she contrasts to somebody like the fairy godmother from Cinderella, but again, they sort of serve that same purpose in that they sprinkle a little bit of good onto the main characters, and then they're ultimately sent on their journey. So that's really the Blue Fairy in a nutshell, and what she kind of represents. But Pinocchio, I think, does a really good job of interweaving all of these different storylines that ultimately end up happening as Pinocchio, as you'll see, will go off on this journey that he ends up embarking on. And you'll see how that unfolds if you choose to watch the film. And it really flows, I think, just really well together. It knows when to be light and happy when it needs to be, and it knows when to be dark and scary. So it does balance out those moments well, sort of similar to Snow White too, where they have kind of intensity and then that release of tension. So that, I think, serves the story good, and is part of the emotional aspects that I would see why people would associate Snow White with Pinocchio with. But I think with Pinocchio, since again we have since we have a boy character who's our main character, and since we have all the other characters that are either men or boys, it's more based on that viewpoint, and you sort of see that viewpoint of, you know, the kind of emphasis and moral character that we put on boys when they're young. You know, be good, work hard, you know, achieve goodness, don't be too selfish, you know, all of those things, which again we can focus on women, on girls too, those morals. But I think it's, again, it just has that quality in there of seeing it through more of a male perspective, because again there's a largely more male cast than a female cast. So you do see sort of the different kinds of interpretations of a story in there, I think, because of the focus. And yeah, I think that's very interesting. And I think Pinocchio definitely serves as a great example of a Disney film. And I think is one of the best that I've seen out of Disney. One of the ones that is the most memorable, the most has this sense of beauty, but strong morals that ground it in a way that I think ultimately ends up working well for the film. And When You Wish Upon a Star, how can you go wrong? There's a lot of little other catchy little numbers within the film as well. So it serves, I think, as a perfect example for Disney. And I think they did a really good job with this movie. And I think they deserve all the props for this film. And I think When You Wish Upon a Star is a very beautiful song, one of Disney's best. It's practically their trademark. I mean, you cannot not escape that. And yeah, I should probably mention though too that there's this whole conflict with this film in regards to the whole When You Wish Upon a Star song. And to me, again, it is more of a symbol of hope, and a symbol of going out and achieving your dreams, and not so much about you know, wishes being granted to you, as opposed to you know, as opposed to what people may think as a literal interpretation, because it's not like when you wish upon a star your dreams come true. It's when you desire something and you go out and pursue it, that's when, you know, your dreams come true. And that's kind of what Pinocchio really wanted, was to be a real boy. It's just that, you know, he had to go out and work for it and achieve it. And when when you when you go out and you try and you do your all into something, I always believe that it ultimately ends up paying off in the long run. Maybe not in the short run, but in the long run. Um, I think if you really want something out of life, it's important to go after it, and that's definitely one of the things that Pinocchio has taught me as a film, um, and is something that I consider uh, an important trademark to Disney, because that's what I felt Disney was as an entrepreneur. He had this dream, he had this vision of what he wanted to create for the world, and he went out there and he did it. Sort of similar to Pinocchio when he was rescuing Geppetto. He went out and he did it, and that's ultimately why I think the film serves the morals well, and the sort of ideals that Disney kind of sort of represents as a company is they were all about um, seeing dreams and then at the same time giving something back um, as a result. And yeah, I think that's really really at the heart of this film, and is definitely one that I think Disney will hold as one of their greats. I don't think there's probably another film that could match this one in the same respects, because it is unique in its own special way. Like Snow White is unique in its own special way, and I think it's one of the best out of Disney. So yeah, definitely classic, category worthy in my opinion. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.